I thought the envelope was a thank you card until I felt how thick it was. That was the moment I realized I hadn't been invited home to celebrate anything. My name is Emily Parker, I'm 26, and this is the story of how my dad turned a family celebration into something that changed how I see him forever. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. When my dad called, his voice sounded lighter than usual. He said he was proud of me. That alone caught my attention. My dad wasn't cruel, but praise wasn't his language. He preferred practicality, numbers, responsibility. I want you home this weekend, he said. We're celebrating. I asked what we were celebrating. Everything, he replied. Life. Family. You. That should have felt good. Instead, it felt vague in a way that made me uneasy. Still, I agreed. I hadn't been home in months, and part of me wanted to believe this was his way of reaching out, of softening, of finally seeing me as more than a line item in his mental budget. When I arrived, the house looked different. Cleaner. More staged. There were balloons tied to the banister, and a banner stretched across the living room that read congratulations. My stepmother, Linda, hugged me tightly and said she was glad I came. My younger half-brother waved from the couch without looking up from his phone. Dad greeted me last. He smiled, clapped a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Big night." The celebration itself felt off. There was food, but nothing I liked. Guests I barely knew. Conversations that circled around promotions, investments, and how expensive everything had gotten lately. Dad made a short speech about family pulling together and how proud he was that we were all doing our part. People clapped. I smiled. I waited for the part where he explained what this was actually about. After dessert, when most of the guests were distracted, Dad motioned for me to follow him into his office. He closed the door behind us and reached into his desk drawer. That's when he handed me the envelope. "At first I thought it was a joke," he said. "But it's not." I opened it slowly. Inside was a printed statement. Itemized. Neat. Precise. Tuition support. Car insurance. Phone bills. Living assistance from the year after I graduated. Interest included. At the bottom was a total that made my stomach drop. "You're billing me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to take responsibility." "For what?" I said. "Being your child." He sighed, like I was being unreasonable. "You're an adult now. This isn't punishment. It's accountability." I stared at the paper again. Every line felt like a revision of my life. Moments I'd thought were help, support, care, rewritten as debts. "You invited me home for this?" I asked. He nodded. I wanted to do it face to face. Seemed respectful. Respectful. I thought about the banner, the guests, the speech about family, the timing. This hadn't been spontaneous. This had been planned. "I never agreed to pay this back," I said. "You didn't object," he replied. That sentence landed harder than the bill itself. Linda knocked lightly on the door, then poked her head in. "Everything okay?" Dad smiled. "Just talking finances." She glanced at the paper in my hands, then looked away quickly. "Well, don't take too long. People are asking for you." The door closed again. I felt something inside me settle, cold and clear. This wasn't about money. It was about control. About reminding me who kept score. "I need time to look at this," I said. Dad crossed his arms. "Of course, but I do expect an answer soon." I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. As I walked back into the living room, the music felt too loud. The smiles felt rehearsed. The banner suddenly looked like a distraction, stretched thin to hide something ugly underneath. That night, lying in my old bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every helpful moment from the past 10 years. And for the first time, I wondered how much of it had ever been free. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw numbers instead of dreams. Totals. Subtotals. Dates I remembered clearly, now reframed as debts I apparently owed. I kept replaying my dad's voice in my head, "You didn't object," as if silence at 22 meant consent for the rest of my life. Morning came too fast. Downstairs, the house was already awake. I could hear Linda moving around in the kitchen, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the coffee maker. Everything sounded normal, which somehow made it worse. Like the night before hadn't happened at all. When I walked in, my dad was already seated at the table, reading the news on his tablet. He looked up briefly. "Morning," he said, casual. "Morning," I replied, sitting across from him. Linda slid a mug toward me. "I hope you slept okay," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I slept," I said. It wasn't a lie. Just incomplete. No one mentioned the envelope. We talked about traffic, about the weather, about how my half-brother was thinking about switching majors again. It felt like a performance, one we'd all agreed to participate in until someone acknowledged what was sitting between us. Finally, I said, "I need to understand something." My dad looked up. "Go ahead. When you helped me after college," I said slowly, "was that always meant to be paid back?" He didn't hesitate. "I assumed it would be." "You never told me that," I said. "You never asked," he replied. There it was again. That same logic. If I didn't question it, it must have been acceptable. If I didn't push back, it must have been permission. "That's not how help works," I said. "That's how responsibility works," he countered. Linda cleared her throat. "Maybe this conversation doesn't need to happen right now." "It does," I said gently, "because I wouldn't have come home if I'd known this was the purpose." My dad's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why I wanted you here." I felt a slow wave of anger rise, not hot, but steady. So the celebration was cover. "It was an opportunity," he said, "to handle something overdue." I pushed my chair back slightly. "You made a spreadsheet of my life." He frowned. "I documented support." "Support doesn't come with interest," I said. He folded his arms. "Everything costs something." That sentence explained more than he probably intended. After breakfast, I went back to my room and closed the door. I pulled the envelope out of my bag and laid the papers across the bed. I read every line carefully this time. Some of the numbers were inflated. Some dates were wrong. A few items were things I'd explicitly been told not to worry about at the time. I remember those conversations clearly. "Focus on getting on your feet. We'll handle this part. Don't stress about it right now." Now it was all being rewritten. My phone buzzed with a text from a friend asking how the weekend was going. I typed fine and deleted it. Typed weird and deleted that too. I wasn't ready to explain this out loud yet. By the afternoon, guests from the night before were gone, and the house felt emptier. My dad asked if I wanted to go for a walk with him, like we used to when I was younger. I almost laughed at the timing. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. We walked side by side for a few minutes before he spoke. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said. "I believe that," I replied. "But you're not trying to understand me either." He stopped walking. "I gave you advantages I never had, and I appreciated them," I said. "I still do. But that doesn't turn them into a loan retroactively." He looked genuinely confused. "Then how do you expect me to see it?" "As parenting," I said quietly. He didn't answer. That silence told me something important. Not that he disagreed, but that he'd never framed it that way before. Parenting, to him, had always been an investment. One with expectations. When we got back to the house, Linda told me she was running errands and asked if I wanted to come. I declined. I needed space. Actual space, not the polite kind. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the banner still hanging crookedly above the fireplace. Congratulations. I wondered what, exactly, I'd been congratulated for. For growing up, for becoming independent, or for being ready to pay up. That evening, my dad knocked on my door. "I need an answer soon," he said. "I'm not getting any younger." "I'm not signing anything," I replied. He exhaled slowly. "Then we'll have to revisit our arrangement." "What arrangement?" I asked. "You already stopped helping years ago." "That doesn't mean I can't adjust future support," he said. I looked at him then, really looked at him. "Is that a threat?" He hesitated just long enough. "I'm saying choices have consequences," he replied. "So do surprises," I said. He left without another word. That night, I booked an early flight home. I didn't tell anyone. I packed quietly, folding my clothes with care, like I needed to leave no trace. Before I went to sleep, I placed the envelope back in my bag. Not because I planned to pay it, but because I planned to remember it. Because no matter what happened next, I knew one thing for sure. This bill wasn't the end of a story. I left before sunrise. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the hallway clock. I moved slowly, careful not to wake anyone, even though a part of me wanted to. Not to argue, just to be seen leaving on my own terms. At the door, I paused and looked back once. The banner was still hanging in the living room, one corner drooping. Congratulations. The word felt almost mocking now. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped outside. The flight home gave me too much time to think. I replayed the walk with my dad. The way he'd set arrangement like it was something mutual. The way support had been quietly reclassified as leverage. I wondered how long he'd been keeping track. How many conversations had been provisional in his mind, waiting for a moment like this. By the time I landed, my decision was firm. I wasn't paying the bill. And I wasn't going to pretend this hadn't changed anything. Back in my apartment, I unpacked quickly and opened my laptop. I scanned the documents and saved copies in a folder labeled plainly, Dad's statement. Seeing it there, reduced to pixels, stripped it of some of its power. It was still upsetting, but it was also just paper. Claims. Assertions. Not facts. That afternoon, my dad called. "You left without saying goodbye," he said. "I didn't want another conversation in the hallway," I replied. He sighed. "I thought we were going to handle this like adults." "We are," I said. "Adults don't ambush each other." There was a pause. "So what's your plan?" "I'm not agreeing to any of this," I said. "And if you think there's a legal basis, you can put it in writing." His tone sharpened. "You're escalating." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm clarifying." Silence stretched between us. "I'm disappointed," he said finally. "I know," I replied. "I am too." We hung up without resolution. Over the next few days, the fallout arrived in pieces. A message from Linda, saying she hoped I'd reconsider. A text from my half-brother asking if everything was okay. A voicemail from my dad that started with concern and ended with reminders about how much he'd done for me. I didn't respond to most of it. Instead, I spoke to a lawyer. Not to start a fight, but to understand my position. The conversation was straightforward. Parental support given without a written agreement, without terms, without disclosure, could not be retroactively converted into debt. "That doesn't mean he won't try to pressure you," the lawyer said. "But it means you don't owe him." Hearing that out loud settled something deep in my chest. I sent my dad a short email later that day. Polite, clear, non-negotiable. I've reviewed the statement. I don't agree with its premise or its accuracy. I won't be paying it. If you believe otherwise, please have your attorney contact mine. I read it twice before sending. No emotion, no justifications, just boundaries. His reply came hours later. "This isn't how family handles things." I stared at the screen, then typed back. "This is how adults protect themselves." After that, the tone shifted again. The messages slowed. The language cooled. The pressure became indirect, filtered through other people. Comments about how money changes people. About how gratitude is rare these days. About how help isn't appreciated. I recognized the pattern. Shame dressed up as disappointment. What surprised me was how little it worked. I felt sad, yes. Angry, sometimes. But I didn't feel confused anymore. The confusion had burned off, leaving clarity in its place. My dad hadn't invited me home to celebrate me. He'd invited me to rebalance a ledger. Once I accepted that, the rest made sense. Weeks passed. We spoke less. When we did, the conversation stayed superficial. Weather, work, news. Nothing that required trust. I noticed something else too. Without the weight of his expectations, I breathed easier. I slept better. I stopped second-guessing my choices. I didn't feel like I was waiting for approval that might never come. One evening, a friend asked how things were with my family. I hesitated, then told the truth. Not the dramatic version. Just the facts. She listened, then said, "That's not normal." "I know," I replied. "I just needed time to see it." The bill sat in my drawer untouched. Not because I was afraid of it, but because it had become a marker. A line I wouldn't cross. I didn't know what the long-term relationship with my dad would look like. I only knew it would be different. Less transactional. Or not close at all. And for the first time, I was okay with that. Because that celebration had revealed something I couldn't unlearn. Love doesn't arrive with an invoice. Care doesn't come itemized. And respect doesn't require you to pay to keep it. Whatever came next, I knew one thing. I wouldn't be surprised again. The longest part wasn't the argument. It was the waiting. After I sent that email, days passed with no response. Not even a short acknowledgement. The silence felt intentional, like another tactic, this time meant to make me uneasy enough to reach out first. I didn't. Instead, I paid attention to what the quiet revealed. My dad had always been present when he was needed. He showed up for graduations, helped with practical problems, offered advice that sounded firm but fair. I had confused consistency with unconditional support. What I was learning now was that his presence came with expectations I hadn't agreed to. And once I stopped meeting them, he withdrew. That realization hurt more than the bill ever could. A week later, Linda called. "I don't want to be in the middle," she said immediately. "You already are," I replied gently. She sighed. "Your dad feels like you're rejecting him." "I'm rejecting the bill," I said. "Not him." She hesitated. "To him, it's the same thing." That sentence explained everything. We talked for a few more minutes, circling the same issue from different angles. She asked if I could at least acknowledge his effort. I told her I had, many times, without agreeing to rewrite history. Before we hung up, she said something that stayed with me. "He's scared," she said. "He doesn't say it, but he is." "Of what?" I asked. "Of being taken for granted," she replied. After the call, I sat with that for a long time. I could understand fear. I just couldn't accept that his way of managing it was to hand me an invoice disguised as a celebration. A few days later, my dad finally responded, not to my email, but with a formal letter. Printed, signed, dated. He reiterated his position, listed the same charges, and added a paragraph about how disappointed he was that I'd chosen to involve outside counsel instead of keeping this within the family. I read it once, then again. There was no threat, no legal action mentioned, just pressure dressed up as principle. I didn't reply. That was new for me, choosing not to respond at all. In the past, I would have explained myself again, softened my words, tried to meet him halfway. This time, I let the silence stand. And something unexpected happened. Nothing. No escalation. No lawsuit. No follow-up. Because beneath all the certainty in spreadsheets, there was no actual footing. Just expectation. Over the next month, our relationship settled into a strange truce. We spoke occasionally, carefully avoiding the subject. He asked about work. I asked about his health. Neither of us mentioned the letter. I noticed the shift in myself during those conversations. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to earn approval. I was simply present, or not. That choice alone felt revolutionary. At a family gathering a few weeks later, someone joked about how my dad always kept track of things. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely. He didn't. For the first time, I saw discomfort cross his face, not because I'd embarrassed him, but because the narrative was slipping out of his control. Later that evening, he pulled me aside. "You really won't reconsider?" he asked quietly. "No," I said. "I won't." He nodded slowly. "I thought you'd come around. I thought you'd apologize," I replied. That was the closest we came to saying what mattered. Driving home that night, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what the relationship might never be. Relief that I no longer had to pretend. The bill stayed unpaid. The celebration stayed unresolved. But I had gained something far more important than closure. I had learned the difference between generosity and accounting, between support and leverage, between love and control. And once you learn that difference, you don't unlearn it. Whatever came next, with my dad, with anyone, I knew one thing. I wouldn't mistake obligation for affection again. Time did what arguments couldn't. It softened the sharpest edges without erasing what had happened. Weeks turned into months, and the bill my dad handed me stopped being a daily weight and became something else entirely. A marker. A clear line between who I used to be and who I wasn't willing to be anymore. We spoke occasionally after that. Short calls. Neutral check-ins. He never brought up the statement again, and neither did I. The silence around it felt intentional on both sides, like we'd quietly agreed to stop pulling on a thread that would unravel everything if tugged too hard. What changed most wasn't my relationship with him. It was my relationship with myself. I stopped feeling guilty for accepting help in the past. I stopped replaying old conversations, wondering if I'd unknowingly signed some invisible contract by saying thank you. The lawyer's words echoed in my head whenever doubt crept in. Support given freely doesn't turn into debt later. I began to see how often I'd carry that fear into other parts of my life. At work, I'd over-deliver to prove I deserved my position. With friends, I'd stretch myself thin, so no one could accuse me of taking more than I gave. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned that value had to be justified. That belief cracked the night my dad handed me a bill. I didn't cut him off. I didn't dramatize the fallout. I simply changed how much access he had to me. And that shift, subtle as it was, rewired everything. At the next holiday, I didn't go home. I made other plans. I told him early and didn't apologize for it. He sounded disappointed, but he didn't argue. I understand, he said after a pause. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I meant what I said. A few months later, he sent me a short message. No subject line. Just a sentence. I shouldn't have done it the way I did. I read it twice. It wasn't a full apology. It didn't erase the past or rewrite his mindset overnight, but it was an acknowledgement. And coming from him, that mattered. I replied simply, "Thank you for saying that." We didn't discuss it further. We didn't need to. The bill never came up again. Not because it had been resolved, but because it had lost its power. It no longer defined our conversations or my sense of worth. Looking back, I understand now why he framed it the way he did. Money was how he understood contribution, accountability, safety. He measured care in practical terms because emotions had never been his strength. But understanding something doesn't mean accepting it. That celebration taught me a lesson I carry into every relationship now. If support comes with conditions, they should be stated up front. If love is real, it doesn't need receipts. And if someone waits years to present a cost, it was never about fairness. I don't regret refusing to pay the bill. Not because I won, but because I chose honesty over comfort. I chose clarity over keeping the peace. And I chose to stop confusing obligation with love. The banner that night said congratulations. In a strange way, it wasn't wrong. That night marked the moment I stopped living like I owed people for existing. And that's a debt I'll never take on again.